Welcome to week 4 of this online course. Once you've become more comfortable with the Nes script, you can move on to the Thuluth script. The word Thuluth means a third, and though it is unclear as to why the script has been given this name, a lot of calligraphers state that the reason why this script is called Thuluth is because all of the horizontal strokes in the script are going down 2/3 of the way and retracting back up 1/3 of the way, kind of like the individual letter ba in Nasq. Arabic calligraphy is Thuluth. There's an old proverb that says that if you haven't learned the Thuluth script, you haven't learned Arabic calligraphy. And this ties in with the next point here, that Thuluth is the most popular Arabic calligraphy script out there. If you took this course, chances are that it's because you wanted to learn the Thuluth script. The script is known for its long vertical strokes, almost 1/3 times longer than the strokes in Nasq. The script is very interweaving and very flexible, so you can be very creative with the script. This script is most popularly used for titles and architectural scripting. The baseline for the Thuluth script looks very similar to the Nasq baseline, the only difference being that instead of 2 nuqtas between the two baselines, the Thuluth script has 3 nuqtas. And this makes sense because the Thuluth is a script that is slightly larger than the Nasq script. And this here is a live version of the baseline we'd be using for our Thuluth demonstrations. As you can see, this is very similar to the Nasq baseline we used, the only difference being that the height of the baseline is 3 nuqtas as opposed to 2. All of the nuqtas that you see above and below the baseline are again optional. The Alif in general in Thuluth is very similar in structure to the Alif of Nasq. The only difference being that this Alif is a lot longer. So as opposed to 7 nuqtas, the Alif in Thuluth can range anywhere from 9 to 11 nuqtas. And also because the script is a little bit longer, you'll need to reload the pen with ink a lot more often. Now, the Alif in Thuluth has a flick going downwards as opposed to the hat in Nasq. And as you can see, just like Nasq, the Alif is leaning towards the left by 1 nuqta. The finishing letter Alif is also very similar to the individual letter. So it would have the same height as the individual letter and would have a very similar structure. And there is the finishing letter Alif. And I'll go ahead and fill up any empty spaces left behind. Now, alternatively, if you would like, you can script the Alifs completely vertical, and that is okay. For the finishing letter Alif, Alternatively, you can create a little stroke at the end of the Aleph going downwards. And this is the version that I was referring to. A finishing letter Aleph that is more vertical than the two versions that we have seen so far. And as you'll notice, it will still start to bend a little bit towards the left as you go up. And there we have the letter Aleph. The ba in the Thuluth script is also very similar in structure to the ba in Nest, except that it would be a little bit longer. The first stroke starts off about 4 nuqtas above the baseline and ends 2 nuqtas above the baseline. And then you would continue on downwards towards the left. And as soon as you hit the baseline, you would retract upwards and finish off the letter ba. The width of this letter in Thuluth is 8 nuqtas. Now if I was to draw a horizontal line here, and then if I was to split the width of this line into 3 segments, you'll notice that the left segment here is where the stroke is curving upwards, and the 2/3 segment on the right side is the segment of the stroke that is going downwards. And this ties in with the Thuluth name, that the horizontal strokes go down for 2/3 of the way and come up for 1/3. Alternatively, you can script the ba like this as well. So instead of the initial flick, if you were to just create a little wave in the beginning, then you can create the ba like this. And this ba would have the same width and proportions as the individual letter. And it'll go ahead and fill up any empty spaces left behind. When ba, noon, or ya appear at the beginning of a macho, the initial stroke is very similar to the first stroke of the individual letter. Like that, and then For the next stroke, you would curve downwards for 2/3 of the way and then curve back up for 1/3 of the way. So in Nasakh, this bevel would have been symmetric, but in Thuluth, this has the same proportions as the individual letter. And the width of this bevel is 2 nuqtas. You can also write the ba with the beginning in a wave. And this is what this commencing letter would essentially look like. So you'd go up towards the right and then come left, downwards, and then curve back up. And as you can see, the width of this bevel is also 2 nuqtas. When ba, noon, or ya appear in the middle of a module, it is a simple symmetric bevel with a width of about 2 nuqtas. Now, just like in Nasakh, if the letter ba is coming in the middle of a module and is followed by another beveled letter, then you can extend the stem of that letter. So again, this is very similar to what we've learned in Nasakh. And the width of this bevel could be 1.5 or even 2 nuqtas. Now there's 2 ways to finishing the letter ba. One of them is going leftwards and then curving downwards. And this is the more common approach of finishing the letter ba in the Thuluth script. So as you can see, the portion underneath on the right hand side is 1.5 nuqtas and the portion on the left is 4.5 nuqtas. Alternatively, you can end the ba in a very regular fashion. Just like this. And again, this is very much like the tail end of the individual letter. The letter Jim in the Thuluth script is very similar to the Jim in the Nasakh script as far as proportions and the overall structure is concerned. So just like in Nasakh, you start off with a small stroke about 2 nuqtas above the baseline, and then script a horizontal stroke above it in a way that it overlaps half of the initial stroke. So you start a little bit to the left of the rightmost point, and then you stretch down till 2 nuqtas below the top baseline. So in this case, we would not stretch it all the way down to the bottom baseline. And then keeping the pen vertical, you would script that last stroke, which will take you 2 nuqtas below the bottom baseline. Now the stroke will end 2 nuqtas to the left of the leftmost point of the initial stroke, just like the Jim in the Nes script. When Jim appears in the beginning of a module, again, it has a very similar shape to the Jim in Nes. And there's the first stroke. And here is the second stroke. And there are the dimensions of the commencing letter Jim. Now, alternatively, you can put a small flick starting from the origin of the Jim, like this. So this is optional. So in Thuluth, just like in Nes, when a Jim appears before another Jim, Mim, or Ya, then you can curve in the second stroke of the letter Jim. So the initial stroke would be very similar to the initial stroke of the individual letter. And so I am curving inwards as opposed to outwards. Just like that. And in this case, we'll connect it to the initial commencing letter. So you can see how this Jim would appear before another Jim. I'll fill in the gaps here. So there we are. When Jim appears in the middle of a module, it looks very similar to the commencing letter Jim. So this, if you notice, is an exact duplicate of the Jim that is right before it. Touch up the bottom stroke here. When Jim appears at the end of a module, it looks very similar to the individual letter. And it is connected right underneath the vortex. So the letter Dal in the Thuluth script is quite different from the Dal that we learned in the Nes script. The first stroke is a diagonal stroke that starts off about 4 nuqtas above the baseline. It is linear at first, but as it approaches the first baseline, it curves in and touches it. The second stroke is a diagonal stroke in the other direction and is a lot shallower than the initial stroke. And the reason is because we are going down only 3 nuqtas and we're actually surpassing and going beyond the vertical point of the origin of this letter. And as we hit the bottom baseline, we would begin to curve back upwards and come all the way up till the top baseline. And you can go ahead and add a little sideways flick on top of the dal, and there we have the individual letter dal. And here are the proportions. Now this vertical line that you see is actually a baseline that I'm using for the finishing letter dal. So for the finishing letter, you would curve upwards to create the stem of the letter, similar to the dal in nasq, except that this is a little bit more slanted and definitely a lot taller. So we're looking at around 6 or 7 nuqtas tall. So there is the stem for dal. Now about 2 or 2.5 nuqtas above the top baseline, we are going to script the tail end of the letter dal, which will come down, hit the baseline, and then retract back upwards. And there are the measurements for the letter dal in the finishing format. So unlike the nasq script, where there was only one way of scripting the ra, there are a few ways that you can script the ra in the thuluth script. So the first version that we will script here is quite basic. It is 8 nuqtas in width. It starts off by going upwards from the top baseline, and then it curves downwards, and as it approaches the bottom baseline, it begins to level out, and then it curves upwards and ends with a flick by the top baseline. Another version of writing the ra in Thuluth is by scripting a stroke that is about 3 nuqtas high, and then you can create a flick on top of that. And the second stroke here, you would go down diagonally, and then as you approach the bottom baseline, you would curve back upwards, just like in the letter previous to this one. So as you can see, the tail end of these letters are exactly the same. And the width of this letter is about 6 nuqtas. Another way you can script the individual letter Ra is by starting off the same way as we did in the previous version. And then for the second stroke, you would also start off the same way in a diagonal fashion, but as you approach the bottom baseline, you would give the pen a flick and you would create a Ra that looks like this. When Ra appears at the end of a module, it can appear a number of different ways. So right now I am scripting a Ba, and that is just to show you where the actual connection would occur. So here I am going to script the third version of the individual letter, and as you can see, the initial stem is quite short, about 1 or 1.5 nuqtas, and then you go ahead and give it a flick at the end. Now this same version here could be alternated with the second version of the individual letter we've learned. The only difference would be that instead of flicking at the end, we would curve back upwards. Now, if you would like to script the first version of the individual letter, then this is how you would do it. So if you were writing a Ba before the Ra, so as you script the second stroke, which goes downwards, you would not come back upwards, but would actually dip down right at the top baseline. You would come down all the way to the bottom baseline, and then curve back upwards, just like the tail end of the individual letter. The letter scene in the Thuluth script is quite similar to the scene in the Nas script. However, there are a few differences, and those are definitely noteworthy. The initial bevel of the individual letter is quite circular as opposed to linear in the Nas script, and is usually scripted in one motion. The second stroke regresses downwards just slightly, so you'll see that the bottom point of the second bevel is a little bit lower than the bottom point of the first stroke. The third stroke starts off about 2 or 2.5 nuqtas above the baseline and ends right at the top baseline. Now you'll be creating a large loop which is 7 nuqtas wide, and according to the proportions of Thuluth, this stroke goes down for 2/3 of the way and comes back up 1/3 of the way. And there we have the individual letters seen. And you can have a look at the measurements here. When scene comes at the beginning of a module, it is basically the initial part of the commencing letter. So the second bevel would actually come down and touch the baseline, which only makes sense that the initial bevel must be a little bit higher. And as you can see, there's about half a nuqta gap between the bottom point of the initial stroke and the top baseline. The third stroke is a simple curved stroke that will lead you to the next letter. And the width of this stroke is about 4 nuqtas. And there we are. Now, alternatively, Sin could also be written in this manner. So the initial two strokes would be exactly the same. The difference would be in the third stroke. So the third stroke would actually resemble the alternative individual letter ba. You would go left and then begin to curve downwards. And then continue the next letter onwards. Just like that. When Sin comes in the beginning of a module, it looks very similar to the commencing letter. So it'd be a bevel, and then the second stroke would be exactly the same as the second stroke of the commencing letter. And then you can select one of these two options for the third stroke. And so we'll use the alternative method here. When Sin appears at the end of a module, it is just like the individual letter, except that it would be connected on the right hand side. So here's the first bevel. Second bevel, the initial stroke for the loop, and then the loop itself. The letter Sad in the Thuluth script is very similar to the Sad in the Nes script. It is a magnified version of the same letter, essentially. So the initial stroke would be exactly the same. You'd go up, and then down towards the left. And again, depending on your dominant hand, you can script this from left to right as well. The second stroke would come down this way. Now, as soon as you approach the initial stroke, you would curve upwards and script a little stem, and then you would come down to the stroke and hit the baseline. Now, the tail end of the sod is just like the tail end of the letter C. So you go down 2/3 of the way, curve back up 1/3 of the way, and stop at the top baseline. Here are the measurements for the letter sod. When sod appears in the beginning of a module, the initial loop is identical to the loop of the individual letter. So here is the first stroke. Here is the second stroke. And again, as I approach the initial stroke, I would curve back upwards. The bevel of the sod is just like the middle letter ba, which is a symmetric figure. And then you can continue on in that manner. When sod appears in the middle of a module, it is just like the commencing letter, which is connected from the bottom on the right hand side. Just like that. And here is the middle letter sod. The finishing letter sod is essentially the individual letter which is connected the same way the middle letter was connected. So if there was a ba before the sod, this is what the connection would look like. And there is the connection underneath. As you can probably tell, ink hasn't been a great friend of mine today. It's been leaving behind several empty spaces, so I'm going to go ahead and fill those in. And there we have the finishing letter Sad. And how can I forget the all-important flick before the ba. The Thuluth letter Ta is another one of those letters that is quite similar to its Nes counterpart. So again, this letter is a combination of the initial loop of Sad and the Alif. So here I'm scripting the initial stroke of the letter Sad, now as I script the second stroke of the letter Sad, it would flatten out and there would be a flick at the end. And I'll fill in any empty spaces here. And now we can go ahead and script the Alif on top of the loop of the Ta. And here we are. And we can go ahead and add the flick on top of the Alif. And here are the measurements for the letter Ta. When Ta appears in the beginning of a module, it looks exactly the same as the individual letter, except that the ending flick would actually be curved upwards in order to continue the next letter. So here is the first stroke. And as the second stroke comes down, this is curved back upwards after it touches the baseline. And I can go ahead and add the Alif on top of the loop of the Ta. And we can add a little flick here. And there is a commencing letter. When Ta appears in the middle of a module, it is essentially the commencing letter, which is being connected underneath, just like the Sad. And there we are. And when Ta appears at the end of a module, it is basically the individual letter being connected from the bottom, like the Sad. And here we have the letter Ta. The letter Ain in Thuluth. I know I sound like a broken record here, but it's very similar to the Ain in the Nes script. Having said that, there are some intricate differences between the two, and they're notable. to the first stroke of Ain, and the second stroke of Ain would go down all the way to the bottom baseline. I would turn the pen vertical and then script the last stroke, which ends in a flip. This stroke again is just like the tail end of the letter G. And just like in Nasr, the top of the Ain is sketched in. And we can just go ahead and fill that shape in. And here are the measurements for the individual letter Ain. And so as you can see, the initial part of this letter is slightly larger than the initial part of the Ain in Nasr. The commencing letter Ain is essentially the initial part of the individual letter. As you come down and hit the baseline, curve back upwards. And again, we can sketch the top of the Ain here. And there we are. When Ain appears in the middle of a module, there are some notable differences between this version and the version we learned in Nasr. So we would start off the same way. We would curve back up, and then we would create curve but symmetric stroke on top, and then the second stroke would look like this. So the major difference here is that there is a gap in the middle of the Ain, which you can see. This is 4 nuqtas wide. In Nasr, this gap is closed. When Ain appears at the end of a module, it is a combination of the middle letter Ain and the tail end of the individual letter. So I would script the top stroke here. And now, it's just a matter of creating the tail end of the letter G. And I'll show you an alternative method we can do this. The ending that we are using here could actually be used for the individual letter, and it could also be used for G, both individually and when G appears at the end of a module. So you'd come down the same way, hit the bottom baseline, curve back inwards, as you do so, you would retract back upwards. Now, because I'm left-handed, I am scripting the stroke in the reverse order, but you can by all means continue on the loop that you were initially scripting. But at the end, this is what the shape should look like. Now, we're going to connect a horizontal stroke here. And as we surpass the initial line of the loop, we would curve back upwards. And here are the measurements for this alternative ending. So you can interchange these two shapes.